Congratulations to the Trump team for allowing the transition to go forward. Oh, President Trump can still refuse to concede. He can still challenge in court. But it's a good thing for all Americans that we're seeing the transition move forward, particularly on COVID and national security. It's also a good thing that we're seeing some challenges to the election, because we need to know whether or not these computers are fair, not only for this election, but for future elections. So for me, today is a good day for democracy. You'll hear why on The Durst Show. If you're enjoying The Durst Show, and I'm getting so many nice emails and letters and calls from people who are loving the show, loving my comments, loving the comments that I'm getting from people who are calling in. If you enjoy the show, please help others discover us by giving us a rating and a review. I'm used to giving the grades, not getting them, but I'm ready to be graded. So please grade me and grade me honesty. No grade inflation. Whatever you think, give us a review. And be sure to like, share, and subscribe to The Durst Show. And remember my promise, you will never be bored. The Trump administration has done the right thing by allowing the Biden transition team access to information necessary to its transition, particularly regarding COVID and national security. There is no conflict between the administration acknowledging that it is likely that Biden will become the president on January 20th, and therefore he needs to have his transition team in place and ready to go on day one. No conflict between that recognition and continuing, if he chooses to challenge the election results and to not concede the election. There's no constitutional, legal, or even ethical obligation for a president to concede an election if he believes that it was unfair. Presidents in the past have challenged election results. Governors have, mayors have, senators, congressmen. Concession is a matter of personal choice, and whether or not one seeks to continue to challenge the election results, either by demanding recounts of recounts, or by going to court. Again, that's a matter of a tactical choice. That's a matter of political, personal choice. I don't know whether or not President Trump is considering running again in 2024, or if he is, whether his advisors have told him it's better for that campaign not to concede and to challenge the election. Those are all political calculations that President Trump, his advisors, will be making and maybe have made already. But there was always every reason to allow the transition work to begin. And I'm really glad that the director of the GSA has opened up the channels of communication and that the president has approved that. It's a good thing for America, and Americans should never suffer as the result of challenges. Look, I remember very vividly back in 2000 when I was part of the team challenging the election results on behalf of then Vice President Al Gore, who was running for president against Bush, against George W. Bush. The transition waited, and at least according to the 9/11 report, maybe that delay in beginning the transition may conceivably have contributed to unpreparedness for what happened on 9/11. That always struck me as a bit speculative, but you never know what causes a problem or what failures are attributable to what actions or inaction. So better safe than sorry. There's no downside to allowing the transition to go forward. Look, presumptive president-elect Biden is already actively involved in the transition. He's picked several people for his cabinet. In my view, quite good choices. I've done work in the past with Tony Blinken. I knew his stepfather quite well, a Holocaust survivor. Tony is a brilliant, brilliant man who has had years and years of experience, always as the number two person, deputy this, deputy that. But he knows the job very well, and he'll be ready to step in on day one. Like Joe Biden, he is a centrist, a moderate. I disagree with some of his policies. He supported the Iran deal. I oppose the Iran deal. I would hope that if they get back in the Iran deal, they will do it in a way that doesn't provide Iran with a green light to begin to develop a nuclear arsenal within a few years. Israel will never allow that, and we'll have a war. So there is no doubt at all that Israel will never permit Iran to develop a nuclear arsenal. They will prevent it by whatever way is necessary, whether it be by computer technology or by an armed attack or by diplomacy or by economic sanctions, with or without the United States. Hopefully it will be with the United States, because a nuclear armed Iran is a danger not only to Israel, but a danger to the Gulf states, a danger to American troops stationed in the Middle East, and ultimately even a danger to Europe and the United States as well, because Iran is not only determined to develop a nuclear arsenal, it's determined to develop and is developing, consistent with the deal, it's developing rockets capable of carrying nuclear bombs long, long, long distances. And the last thing the world needs is another North Korea, this time in the middle of the Middle East, right in the shipping lanes for oil and right in the center of much of the world economy. So there's every interest in preventing Iran from developing a nuclear arsenal. I hope Anthony Blinken, will do his best to prevent that from happening. He's a decent person. He has a good record. Again, disagree on a number of issues, but in general, he's a centrist moderate, stands for, I think, the best of the Democratic Party. He's already been attacked by people in the squad. That's a good sign that the squad doesn't like him. Some of the criticism has bordered on anti-Semitism. Blinken is Jewish. His stepfather was a Holocaust survivor. And already we're hearing attacks on him from the hard left because of his ethnicity and his history and association with Holocaust, and his presumed support for Israel, which is reflective of his boss, that is Joe Biden, who also supports Israel. Biden has also presumptively appointed Janet Yellen, who grew up in Brooklyn, not too far from where I was born. She, as you know, has served in many, many capacities in the economy, and seems to be again, centrist, stabilizing force at a time when we need real expertise on the economy. She will be replacing a great Secretary of the Treasury, Steve Mnuchin, who has done wonderful, wonderful work, and who himself has had vast experience in the economy, and he has been an incredible Secretary of the Treasury, and I think he's going to be replaced by an equally good Secretary of the Treasury. There are other appointments which I know I will be critical of, and even though I'm a liberal Democrat, I will always be critical of actions taken by Democratic presidents, Democratic senators, and Democratic politicians when I think they violate principles, when they're not good for the country, when they're not good for peace. So I will always commend people I voted against when they do the right thing, and condemn people I voted for doing the wrong thing. I'm not trying to hint at who I voted for or voted against in the 2020 election. I'm not disclosing that. I think you know I voted for Hillary Clinton, campaigned for her, contributed to her in 2016. But my policy has always been to attack those I voted for and commend those I voted against when appropriate. So it's a good thing. It's a good thing that we're moving toward the transition. Now I'm going to surprise you, because I think it's also a good thing that we're seeing challenges to the election. I don't believe the challenges will in the end succeed, but I think it's a good thing there are challenges. Let me tell you why. These challenges, whether they're successful or not, have revealed flaws in our system. and we have to look at those flaws in our system. They've raised a lot of serious constitutional questions and some very, very important issues of law. Let's go to Pennsylvania for a minute. There you have the legislature basically saying that for mail-in votes to be counted, they have to arrive before the close of business on Election Day. They're a reasonable decision. I myself personally disagree with it. I think as long as they're postmarked and sent before the close of business on Election Day, they should be counted. But reasonable people can disagree, and under the Constitution, that decision is up to the legislature. But in Pennsylvania, the courts overruled that decision essentially, and because of COVID, extended the deadline 3 days. Were they right? Were they wrong? Don't know. Did they act in violation of the Constitution? Apparently, yes. That's an issue which should be resolved by the courts, if not for this election, because it may not affect the outcome of the election, then certainly for future elections. We should know the answer to that question, and the courts can provide the answer to that question. They won't if it's just a hypothetical, but they might if they think it could affect the outcome of the election. The second issue in Pennsylvania is equally important. You had some counties that allowed people to come in and correct flawed ballots. That seems like the right thing to do. But other counties refused to do that. Now, which county is right or which county is wrong doesn't so much matter as you have inequality. You have some votes being counted, some identical votes not being counted. That is, at least arguably, a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution. The Supreme Court so ruled in Bush versus Gore in an analogous situation. So we should have one standard for every county. Either you allow people to come in within a certain period of time and correct flawed ballots, or you don't allow it. But you don't allow it in one place and then allow it in another place. That is a denial of one person, one vote. It's denial of equal protection. Whether that rises to the level of a constitutional question, I am doubtful. But it certainly rises to the level of a serious issue that ought to be cured. Now we come to the most important issue in the election, the use of computers that have been challenged and questioned. I have to tell you, I do not know the answer to that issue. I don't know whether Sidney Powell or the other lawyers are correct when they say that these computers were manufactured here and there, and the software program was done here and there, and Venezuela was involved, and people were paid off. I have my skepticism about those issues. But I want to know whether the computers are accurate. I want to know whether it's true that 6,000 votes were shifted from one candidate to the other. I want to know how safe computers are for voting, because we're moving in a direction where today it's mail-in ballots, tomorrow it may be computer voting. We're not there yet, but we have not only a right but an obligation to know how computers work. I'm told that in many states, maybe all, maybe most, I don't know, computer ballots that are counted on the computer all have backup paper ballots so that the computer count can be checked against the paper count. If that's the case, that really is a failsafe. And if there is no major incompatibility between the paper ballot counting and the computer counting, that strongly suggests circumstantially that the computers haven't been rigged, haven't been fixed, haven't been bollocksed up, that computer voting seems okay. But if there is a major disparity between the backup paper ballots and the computer votes, then we have a problem, and we have to look into the problem. So 2 points. Number one, I absolutely do not condemn lawyers who want to take challenges to the very end. That's what I do for a living when I'm a criminal defense lawyer. I may lose in the initial court of appeals. I may lose in the subsequent court of appeals. I had a case once where I lost in the New York Court of Appeals. I lost in the United States Supreme Court, and I think most other lawyers would have given up. No, I went and got federal habeas corpus and won the case and freed my client from a crime he didn't commit. And so I was very proud of that. So you never give up if you're a lawyer. I say to my clients, you're my client for life, or as long as you're in prison. And were I a lawyer for President Trump? I'm not. In this case, I was. During the impeachment case, I was a lawyer for the presidency and for the Constitution, and I stood up against the impeachment of President Trump. If I were the lawyer now, I might advise him to concede. I might advise him to stop the litigation. I might advise him. I certainly would have advised him to cooperate in the transition. I don't know whether I would have advised him to concede and to stop the challenge. I just don't know. I don't know enough about the facts. I don't know enough about what his attitude is. If he asked me for advice, that's a different issue. But I absolutely don't condemn the lawyers for following their clients' advice to please proceed and litigate to the nth degree. Lawyers have a responsibility, obviously, not only to be honest to the court. That's a binding ethical responsibility. You can't mislead a court or lie to a court. But they also have an ethical obligation to be honest to the public. And they should not be making claims that are not supported by the evidence. But if they have a good faith belief that the evidence is there, even if they turn out to be wrong, that's something a lawyer is entitled to do. So I think on balance, it's a good thing to challenge the computer voting and the computer counting, because maybe we'll have a hearing in court. Maybe we'll learn more about it. If there's no hearing in court, maybe there'll be legislative hearings. Maybe Congress should appoint an independent, nonpartisan commission to look into computer issues in elections. That would be a good thing. Now, it grew out of this disputed election. A lot of people are upset that the president didn't concede, that he's continuing to challenge. And, if you want to be upset at the president for that, well, take it out on him. If he runs for re-election, that's your option, that's your choice. But I do think that the American public benefits from exposure of the problems. Sunlight is indeed the best disinfectant, as Justice Louis Brandeis said 100 years ago or more. And bringing sunlight onto the dark intricacies of computers, especially for people like me. I don't even own a computer. I don't know how a computer works. Yeah, I have an iPhone, a smartphone, and I do use the Google and all that stuff, but I don't know how a computer works. I'm not an expert in artificial intelligence, and most Americans are not. But we know a problem when we see one. And if there are allegations, either of computer fraud, those are very serious charges and have to be looked into because those carry criminal punishments, or just computer glitches. We know computers, just on my iPhone, the other day, I got like hundreds of emails in the middle of the night thanking me for joining every association club, subscribing to every magazine and every book in the world. Somebody obviously was hacking my iPhone. So we know computer glitches exist, and we have an obligation to find out whether they have any impact on the election at all or on future elections. So 3 cheers for the Trump administration for cooperating with the transition. Maybe I'll give them 2.5 cheers. I would have preferred if they had done it a little earlier. 2 cheers for the lawyers who have been pushing these legal issues and trying to get hearings and trying to get the evidence. 2 cheers, because I want to make sure I hold the 3rd cheer back to make sure that they really had a basis for making these very, very serious claims. And in the end, I'll probably give 2.5 cheers to some of the lawyers and maybe only 1.5 cheers or less to others of the lawyers. You can't generalize about lawyers. I want to know what each of the lawyers had as evidence before they made the allegations they made. And, it may be they had all the evidence. Maybe they get the 3 cheers. Let's wait and see. So I think we can anticipate that in the next days or weeks, we may not see a concession. We may not see an elimination of the challenges, but we will see certification of enough votes. Pennsylvania, Michigan already has done that, Georgia, Nevada, Arizona. We're going to see enough certifications so that there can be a relative assurance that the Electoral College, when it meets and votes on December 14th, will cast 306 or whatever number above 270 for the then President-elect of the United States, Joe Biden. When that happens, I want to wish the President-elect the best. I hope he will govern wisely and for the good of all Americans. I offer my service, as I have to every single president, in my adult life, starting, I think, with Jimmy Carter, who I worked with on sentencing reform, and to every president since. I offer my support. I'm a patriotic American. I support the presidency of the United States. I support the government that's in power while they're in power and they represent the people of the United States, whether I voted for them or not. I reserve the right to criticize everything done by any government, by any president, by any senator, by any congressman. And then just one final word. Yes, I am a liberal Democrat. Yes, my preference would be for the Democrats to control the Senate, but I cannot support the election of the Reverend Warnock, who would be possibly the deciding vote to give control of the Senate over to Democrats. I'm getting a lot of emails from friends saying, just put that aside. You may be right about Warnock, but it's more important for the Democrats to control the Senate. I do not agree. I don't compromise for partisan purposes with my principles. And my principles do not allow me to support the Reverend Warnock unless and until he absolutely renounces what he said about the American military, what he said about Israel, what he said about the security barrier in Israel, and what he said about a great many things. So for me, principle comes before partisanship, and I will not be supporting the Reverend Warnock at the moment. I will not be supporting the Democrat control of the Senate. That will make me lots and lots of enemies on the Democrat side. It make me enemies in the White House. I know how to deal with enemies. I've had plenty of them over time. I have a lot of good friends, fewer than I used to have as the result of my support for President Trump's fight against his unconstitutional impeachment. I have good friends and I value my friends, but I also have a great enemies list. I have a great list of people who hate me and who are my enemies, and I'm very proud of my enemies list because I make enemies based on principles. I make enemies based on people who violate core principles. And if I make enemies among Democrats because I refuse to support the Reverend Warnock, that's an enemy list or an enmity that I would be very proud of. I'm going to stick with my principles. 82 years old. I'm a little too old to change from a principled person to a hypocrite just to gain more friends or gain some popularity. That's not the way I live. That's not the way I act. And that's not the way I speak on the Der Show. On the Der Show, you'll always hear principle over partisanship. You may disagree with me. Please disagree with me. And when you disagree with me, call me. I love your calls. You're the wits at the end of the Der Show. Der Show wits. You're the wits. So now, please, let's hear your calls, your criticisms, your comments on the Der Show. Our first call today is from Mike in Florida.
I wanted to ask your opinion if what you thought about if the Joe Biden administration were to prevent the Americans' right to assemble as the coronavirus became more of a problem, or violating our religious freedoms by rejecting a vaccine if, under the Biden administration, he deems it mandatory.
Very good questions. Let me give you my views first on mandatory vaccine. I support the mandatory vaccine. If it's a vaccine designed to prevent spread of illness to others, you can't mandate somebody to take a vaccine that's just designed to help themselves. If we were, thankfully, to develop a vaccine to prevent cancer or heart disease, I would immediately take it, but I couldn't force you to take it. I put it very dramatically when I say you have the right to inhale a cigarette in my house, but you don't have a right to exhale it at me. The same thing is true about vaccines and illnesses. You may have the right to die from an illness, but you don't have the right to expose me and make me and my children and my family die as the result of your illness. So if the vaccine is safe, efficient, tested, I think mandatory vaccination is permissible under the Constitution and desirable. The United States Supreme Court, in a very early case, Jacobson versus Massachusetts, ruled that smallpox vaccine could be made mandatory. In that case, it was only a fine, to be sure. But I think the principle of the case would allow compulsion of every reasonable kind. I don't think we're going to have that problem. I think that people are going to be lining up to get the vaccine. and the people who are lining up to get it voluntarily should get it first. Then we'll reach the issue of the anti-vaxxers or people who don't want the vaccine or people who have religious objection. Let me be very clear about the religious objection. Under our Constitution, religious objections have no greater status than secular objections. If somebody has a philosophical objection, it's no lower in the status than religious objections. As long as there is a universal rule that is not applied specifically to religions. You couldn't have a rule that says churches and synagogues and mosques can't be open. But you could have a rule saying no building that houses more than 100 people can be open unless a certain number of people are in it. You can have an objective neutral rule, and then religious objection doesn't have a higher status, but it doesn't have a lower status. And so it would be, I think, unconstitutional to allow gyms to be open and bars to be open and Black Lives Matter demonstrations to go forward and then say that religious services that are comparable in safety and health can't go forward. That would be, I think, unconstitutional. These are hard issues, and these will come to the court. And this is a court, the current Supreme Court, that's going to be very sympathetic to religion, maybe even give it a kind of preference that I don't believe the Constitution gives it. I think the Constitution regards religion and other forms of speech and exercise of philosophical rights equal status, but some on the court may differ because the First Amendment specifically mentions religion, but it also mentions the right to peacefully assemble and the right of free speech. So these are issues that will come before the court, but your question's a very, very good one. I hope we quickly develop a safe and effective vaccine that has no side effects or few side effects. I hope the vast majority of Americans take it. I hope we can then end the current plague and epidemic that is causing so much harm, suffering, illness, and death. And I hope we can all join together and agree on what the right approach is to wearing masks and social distancing and closing of various forums. I hope we can reach more agreement than disagreement in the kind of country we live in today, so deeply divided that may be a fond hope rather than a reality. Our next call is from Virginia. Brian?
Even though you are a Democrat, much easier for me, I in my mind, because I'm a Republican, and my faith is tied to my Republican stance. For you, and it does complicate it for me also, knowing that you are a Democrat. In some ways, I feel like most Democrats have no faith or any guidance of life or any boundaries or balance. But that's not all. But that's not the case for all. And I realize that now. When I was younger, I was much more skeptical, much more judgmental. As I get a little older, I realize that you can be a Democrat and be a person that has good values and possibly good faith. But my advice to you would be to search your faith or search your ideas, because I do think that the Israel stance that he has taken, it's pretty strong, is a bad one, and I do think that it would be impossible for me to vote for him. Be easy for me to vote for the people in Georgia because I'm a Republican, so I generally vote on Republican lines. But for your issue, Democrat that has shown some pretty anti-Israel stances, I can't imagine how you can vote for him.
Great question. I appreciate it. I'm glad you're getting a little older and you're getting to understand that there's some good guys among the Democrats. There are also some bad guys among the Republicans, bad guys among the Democrats. We have a mixture, and we ought to respect each other. Look, families are divided along Democrat or Republican lines. My one wish is I would like to have more Democrats listen to my show, more Democrats calling in. So far, most of the calls have come from Republicans. Not all, but most, and not all listeners are callers. So maybe I have a core of Democrats, people in the center like me, who generally vote Democrat but will vote Republican when the appropriate candidate is put forward. But there are good people on both sides. I don't want to paraphrase what has been misinterpreted, what President Trump said in Charlottesville. but there are good Democrats, there are good Republicans, there are bad Democrats, and there are bad Republicans. And we hopefully, all of us, share a common love for our country, a common love for decency, and a common desire to see the world at peace and not afflicted by these terrible, terrible illnesses. So keep calling in. Democrats, if you're listening to the show, call in, make your point known as well. And thank you very much for an excellent call. Our next call is from New Jersey. Carlos?
My gripes are against corporations that are the individual hides behind the corporations. Should the corporations be allowed to live, or should an individual be responsible for the business? As we are right now, all these corporations, all the people are hiding behind the corporations, and thereby no one is responsible or liable for their actions.
A great question. When I was a second-year law student, I wrote a law review article. It's what made me editor-in-chief of the Yale Law Journal. That article, it was well received, about corporate responsibility and about the relationship between individuals and corporations and how corporations aren't real people. I disagree with the United States Supreme Court decision saying that corporations have First Amendment rights. I don't think so. I think only people have rights. Corporations are legal fictions, legal structures. They're important. They limit liability, but they can't be used to hide individual and personal responsibility. Individuals who run corporations should be held responsible for corporate crimes and corporate sins, and not criminally for sins, but morally for sins. But you're absolutely right. We today elevate the corporate form over a realistic assessment. Corporations don't make decisions. Individuals make decisions. We're going to see the same problem arise in the future with artificial intelligence. Computers are now making decisions, but they're programmed by human beings, and human beings must always be responsible for every action. We can't in any way diffuse human responsibility by focusing on either the corporation or the computer or any other non-human entity. Human beings are the responsible people for every action taken that affects other human beings. Thanks for your call. Our next call is from the contested state of Pennsylvania. Bob.
And just had a question for you, and I know you've talked about different people and their opinions of Israel and the Jewish state there and how things are going between them and the Palestinians. And I've seen some things lately from a guy who it seems by many people's standard is a respected journalist, is Glenn Greenwald. And I can't figure out why he seems to have been putting out a lot of stuff that is certainly anti-Israel. So without, certainly yourself asking him why, do you have any idea why somebody who seems to be very intelligent, and I've seen him, discuss other topics, and he seems extremely articulate, would have this type of an attitude about Israel and their lack of rights to where they're at and everything, and it's just a negative attitude about them in general, and I think I'm understating it. But if you could explain that to me, why some people have that view at all, if you have any idea. And I think you just have a great viewpoint on these things. You're very good at explaining them. I would love it.
Thank you for your question. I've been asking that question myself for years. There are many things about Glenn Greenwald's career that I admire. He has generally been an independent journalist. He stood up for independent journalism on Israel. He has an absolute blind spot. Israel can do no good. The Palestinians can do no harm. He is totally one-sided to the point of, I believe, bigotry, and he just doesn't tell the truth about Israel. He only presents the negative aspects of Israel, never presents the positive aspects. For example, no country in the history of the world faced with threats comparable to those faced by Israel. No country has ever had a better record of human rights, higher compliance with the rule of law, more concern with the safety and life of enemy civilians. Is Israel perfect? Of course not. No country is perfect. But no country faced with comparable threats has ever been better. No country in the history of the world has ever contributed so much to the welfare of the world in so short a period of time as Israel has in in 72 years of its existence. Yet you never hear that from Glenn Greenwald. So, Glenn Greenwald, if you're listening to my show, I hereby invite you to come on my show and debate Israel with me. Explain to your listeners, your viewers, explain to this questioner why you seem to have such a blind spot about Israel. Is it because your name is Greenwald and maybe you were born Jewish, maybe you were not? I don't know anything about your ethnicity or history. Are you leaning over backwards? Are you one of those people who are regarded as self-hating Jews? Why do you apply a double standard to the nation state of the Jewish people? Why don't you apply the same standard to other countries? Why don't you apply the same standard to Hamas, to Hezbollah, to the Palestinian Authority, to people who murder in cold blood civilians, children, just because they're Jewish and live in Israel? I want to understand why you have that blind spot about Israel. Is it bigotry? Is there a good reason? I don't think there's a good reason, but I fundamentally disagree with Greenwald, and I agree with the question. How can a person who seems like he's smart and decent have such an indecent view about one group of people? If there were one African country in the world, one black country in the world, and only one, and somebody went out of his way, a white person went out of his way only to criticize that country of black people, without criticizing any other country, there'd be a word for it. And I think there's a word, whether you're Jewish or not, for people who single out Israel for condemnation and apply a double standard to the nation state of the Jewish people. And it's called anti-Semitism. And, you can be a critic of Israel. I'm a critic of many of Israel's policies. If you're an Israeli, you can single out Israel for criticism. But if you're not an Israeli, then you have to apply a single standard. Look, as an American, I can have a double standard. I'm more critical of my own country maybe than any others because I'm a citizen of my country. The same thing might be true of Israelis. But if you're a Presbyterian minister or a commentator on television like Glenn Greenwald or somebody else who has no direct connection to Israel, you must apply the same standard of criticism to Israel as to all other countries. If you were to rank Israel on a list of the 200 countries in the world, by any standard of decency, by any standard, human rights, compliance with the rule of law, concern for enemy civilians, decency, humanitarianism, contribution to the world, Israel would be near the very top of any such list. And yet, according to Glenn Greenwald and others, it's on the bottom of any such list. That's just bigotry, plain and simple. And so, Glenn Greenwald, I challenge you to appear in my show. I will give you a full opportunity to express your point of view, and then you'll hear my point of view, and then let the public decide. Our final call is from the District of Columbia. Phil.
I just had two quick questions. One, are you going to have a Q&A for students or anybody to be able to raise questions and challenges to some of the things you've raised? And two, would you consider making this essentially discussion into a debate format so that somebody else could champion counter arguments to some of what you're proposing and discussing?
Great questions, and yes. I want to have dialogue and discussion. Please send me names of people you would like me to invite on my show. I have invited some people to be on the show, but I'd like to have others, and I'd like to have more of a debate format. I'd like to hear both sides of every issue, and so either by calling in with suggestions of people to have on the show, or leaving a message, or writing to the show, please let me know who you think should be on the show. And if you know anybody who wants to be on the show, who would make a good guest, have them call me, and I'm happy to consider inviting them. But I agree with you. I think having a back and forth, I have a back and forth, of course, with my listeners, but and the people who make calls, but it would be great to have more people on the show itself where we can have an exchange of views live. For those of you who are listening to participate, you can pick sides, or you can just listen to both sides and decide at the end which side you agree with. But I agree with debate. I agree with the Socratic method of dialogue, and I always want to hear all sides of every issue presented. You'll always hear neutral, objective views on the Der Show. Hopefully you'll hear conflicting views on the Der Show, and again, my promise to you, you'll never be bored. An important part of the Der Show is your voice, your questions, your comments. Please call 24/7. The number is 216-710-0009. 0050. Keep your comments short and to the point. Again, the number for you to call 24/7 is 216-710-0050. Hard questions, criticisms, everything's fine. Just keep your questions short, and I'll answer them all on The Durst Show.